Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, on the 27th of October, Pope Pius XII issues the encyclical Summi Pontificatus, which denounces totalitarianism. The encyclical expresses compassion for displaced Poles, but avoids condemning Germany by name. Heinrich Himmler issues a secret directive to the SS and police, encouraging them to procreate with women of good blood, even outside of marriage, to regenerate life for Germany. On the 28th of October, Soviet troops enter Latvia. On the 31st of October, Benito Mussolini dismisses 3 military chiefs, all of whom have been popularly considered pro-German. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov sends an ultimatum to Finland, making several demands, including that the town of Hanko be handed over for the use as a Russian naval base. On the 1st of November, Chinese forces begin a winter offensive, and on the 2nd of November, the Polish government-in-exile dissolves the parliament and creates a national council. In 1940, on the 27th of October, Italy's ambassador to Greece issues an ultimatum demanding that Italian troops be allowed to occupy strategic areas of Greece. On the 28th of October, the Greco-Italian War begins when the Italians invade Greece. Hitler and Mussolini meet in Florence to exchange the latest war information. Mussolini was in high spirits and told Hitler, "Don't worry, in 2 weeks it will all be over." After the meeting, Hitler said it was pure madness and that he should have attacked Malta instead. On the 29th of October, the British occupy Crete and begin to mine waters around Greece. Conscription under the US Selective Training and Service Act goes into effect. In a radio address, Pétain says he's embarking on the path of collaboration. On the 31st of October, the Battle of Britain ends. Since the 8th of October, the Luftwaffe had lost 2,375 planes, while the RAF had lost 800. The Warsaw District government moves Jews to ghettos, and on the 1st of November, Turkey declares neutrality in the Greco-Italian War. In 1941, on the 27th of October, Erich von Manstein's 11th Army breaks into the Crimean Peninsula. President Roosevelt makes an address on Navy Day declaring that when we have helped win the curse of Hitlerism, we shall help to establish a new peace which will give to decent people everywhere a better chance to live and prosper in security and in freedom and in faith. Each day that passes, we are producing and providing more and more arms for the men who are fighting on actual battlefronts. That is our primary task. And that day, Palestinian leader Amin al-Husseini arrives in Rome for talks with fascist leaders. On the 28th of October, the Germans break the Soviet defensive line south of Pula. On the 29th of October, the Kaunas massacre of Lithuanian Jews takes place. On the 30th of October, the siege of Sebastopol begins. Charles Lindbergh tells an American First rally in Madison Square Garden that Roosevelt was using dictatorship and subterfuge to draw the US into the war. On the 31st of October, Nazi Germany announces heavy taxation increases for tobacco, spirits and champagne, mainly to cut consumption. On the 1st of November, the Germans occupy Simferopol in Crimea. And on the 2nd of November, the Finnish conquest of East Karelia is completed. In 1942, on the 27th of October, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands ends in tactical Japanese victory, but strategic American victory. The Battle of Goodenough Island ends in Australian victory. Leading British clergymen and political figures hold a public meeting to express their outrage at the persecution of Jews by Nazi Germany. Churchill sends a message to the meeting stating that free men and women denounce these vile crimes. On the 30th of October, the defence of the Anchimushke quarry in Crimea ends with German victory. On the 31st of October, the Luftwaffe bombs Canterbury. Hitler moves his headquarters to the Wolf's Lair. On the 1st of November, US forces begin the Matanikau offensive. Strikes break out in Haute-Savoie against forced recruitment of labour for Germany. And on the 2nd of November, Operation Supercharge, the second phase of the Second Battle of El Alamein, begins. In 1943, on the 27th of October, the Special Air Service raids Ankara and Paskara and cuts the rail line between the two cities. The Battle of the Treasury Islands begins in the Solomon Islands. On the 28th of October, the Allied raid on Choiseul in the Solomon Islands begins. On the 29th of October, German actor and comedian Robert Dorsey is executed after being convicted of ongoing activity hostile to the Reich. On the 30th of October, the Moscow Declaration is issued by US Secretary of State Cordell Hull, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and Fu Bingchang from the Republic of China government. The Japanese-controlled Chinese Republic signs a treaty with Japan. On the 31st of October, the Red Army cuts the Germans' rail link to the Crimea by capturing Chaplinka. On the 1st of November, US Marines land on Bougainville Island, and on the 2nd of November, the Fifth Army reaches Italy's Garigliano River. In 1944, on the 27th of October, German forces capture Banska Bystrica, bringing the Slovak national uprising to an end. On the 28th of October, Bulgaria signs an armistice with the Western Allies, and Charles de Gaulle orders the French resistance to disarm. On the 29th of October, Soviet and Romanian forces begin the Budapest offensive. Heinrich Himmler orders the closure of gas chambers at Auschwitz and other extermination camps. On the 30th of October, the Eighth Army reaches Forlì in Italy. The US Third Army completes the capture of Mézières-les-Metz. Finnish forces capture Muonio in northern Finland, and the Greek government bans the leftist militia group Ilas. On the 31st of October, 25 RAF Mosquito planes raid the Gestapo headquarters at Aarhus University in Denmark. The last German forces evacuate Salonika. On the 1st of November, an American superfortress conducts the first Allied flight over Japan since the Doolittle raid of 1942, and on the 2nd of November, Tito becomes Yugoslav Prime Minister. In 1945, on the 27th of October, the Battle of Surabaya begins as part of the Indonesian National Revolution. On the 28th of October, the Czech government orders the confiscation of German and Hungarian property in the country. On the 29th of October, a Japanese general, Tomoyuki Yamashita, goes on trial for war crimes in a US military court in Manila. On the 2nd of November, 42 Dachau concentration camp guards are indicted at Nuremberg, and on the 8th of November, Hungarian former Prime Minister Laszlo Bardossi is sentenced to death for war crimes. Well, there you are. A lot of dates from 39 to 45 for some really significant moments. And we're going to be discussing those in detail with Joe Quinn and our special guest in Northern Ireland, Scott Edgar. So first, I'm going to bring in Joe Quinn. Yeah, hi, Joe.
Good afternoon, Eddie, or good evening, Eddie, I should say.
Yeah, before we start, I just wanted to say something, and then relevant to people who've got Ireland in our hearts and our heads. And last week on the 20th of October, there was a funeral at Clogher Cathedral in Tyrone, very close to the border with the Republic. And it was for, Hugh Stewart. Now, it's Hugh Stewart, very distinguished Northern Irish family. And one of the couple of reasons I want to mention that is first that Hugh Stewart's brother was in the RAF and died in 1944. So, you know, his brother lived right on to now, and his 22-year-old brother died in 1944. But also his Hugh, that is the gentleman whose funeral took place last week. Hugh's sister married this guy you see in this picture in the top right. And that is Lieutenant Colonel Beecham Butler, when he was killed on the attack on the Trigno River on the 27th of October, 1943. So that's 82 years ago, yesterday. And that is the headstone. That is Beecham Butler's headstone in his grave in the Sangro River Cemetery that we visited. I visited several times. And I want to take the opportunity to express my condolences to the family of Hugh Stewart, particularly to our good friend Patrick Butler. Patrick is the son of Beecham Butler. So Patrick was born after, never knew his father. And I want to say my best wishes and regards to them all. So, right, Joe. So I'm going to one more slide, and then we'll get going. I'm going to now introduce our guest. That is Scott Edgar, who is based in Belfast. He is a highly respected historian working on the digital sphere, and his mission in life, I believe, Scott, is to tell the story of Northern Ireland in the Second World War. Is that true? Tell me about your online activity.
Yeah, broadly speaking, that's my mission. I don't know if it's a lifetime mission. It's a mission that I started about 12 years ago. And anytime I speak to anyone from my family, they will ask, "You must be almost done by now." It's a finite period of time, 6 years. It's a very small country. You would think there's not that much history to get around, but every story uncovers a new story. So we have a website, a very limited YouTube channel, and a podcast series, which I need to get up and running again. And yeah, we tell more of the social history of Northern Ireland and how that ties into larger events during the Second World War.
Well, I think you're underselling your story there, Scott, if you don't mind me saying. Northern Ireland played a very full part in the Second World War. Tens of thousands of men and women served in the armed forces, including in the Irish Brigade, of which my father was a member, and then the other 9 regiments that were involved in the Second World War, and mainly based in Northern Ireland. And of course, the Northern Ireland was hit by the bombs. It was critical in the convoys, the wartime industries, and then, of course, 300,000 Americans trained in Northern Ireland, including the Rangers. So that's a terrific story. Now, where can people find out? Where do they need to go to get, to make contact with you?
If you go to wartimeni.com, you can get in touch with me through the website. You can use the search function on there to look up anything that you want, as well as articles about the American soldiers. I've been taking a deep dive into the Belgian army who trained here in 1945. We podcast episodes about German prisoners of war, 6,500 of them held in Northern Ireland. Obviously, a lot of material relating to the Blitz. But yeah, it really emphasizes that multicultural aspect of that period of time in Ulster.
Now, for anybody from Ireland, obviously the Reformation is something that is still close to our heads, if not our hearts. So it was a very interesting moment last week in Rome when King Charles, the Supreme Governor of the Anglican Church, directly in line to Henry VIII, he visited the Vatican and was received by Pope Leo in the middle, and then also with Queen Camilla. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is interesting, and then we'll get on to the character on the right, which is Pope Pius. Charles, of course, is the son of a Second World War veterans. His father was in the Royal Navy. He was in the Atlantic. He was in the Mediterranean, and he was also in the Pacific. And he was on the 2nd of September 1945. He was in Tokyo Bay and had a very distinguished war record. He was decorated. Pope Leo's father, and not many people know this, he was an American. He was in the US Navy, and he was on LST 286, which landed on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944. So when you see Saving Private Ryan and you see the Rangers storming ashore, Pope Leo's dad was on an LST, a big ship, very close by on that day. And after after Normandy, the LST was shipped round to Naples, which makes a connection with me because my father's an Italian campaign veteran, and he was involved in shipping American troops to South France, Operation Dragoon, and he was in Rome on VE Day. So in May 1945, he was in Rome. So there's two extraordinary King Charles and Pope Leo, both of them sons of men who were actually Italian campaign veterans. And Queen Camilla's got orange story because her father, Bruce Shand, got the military cross twice. He was in the Lancers in the Second World War, was taken prisoner. So very distinguished. Anyway, now we're coming on to the first talking point, which is about Pope Pius XII, character on the right. And as we mentioned in the dates, he came out and issued a statement in which he condemned totalitarianism. And you got to remember, this is just over a month after the Nazis invaded Poland, and mainly Catholic areas of Poland. And the Pope actually got his act together and actually issued a statement. So it's an opportunity for us briefly just to review Pope Pius in the Second World War. There's a lot of stuff said about what the Pope's role in the Second World War is. Joe, what is the academic consensus, would you say, now about Pope Pius?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Pope Pius XII's reputation is still very severely tarnished because of the Vatican's conduct in the lead up to the Second World War, more than just during the Second World War. There was a feeling that the Vatican were playing in the middle ground between endorsing fascism and reinforcing the rights of small nations and the rights of small states, of which they themselves were advocates and protectors of. And, the Vatican was a small state itself. It occupied a position. It was one of countless states around the world that adopted a policy of neutrality, so it was officially neutral during the Second World War, deeply obviously connected with the Italian state and with many Catholic countries around the world, including Ireland and also, more importantly, Poland. The invasion of Poland, and this is a point that I alluded to in a previous conversation, caused a deep moral outrage within a number of other Catholic countries, including Ireland. But the thing was that, and this is where things were a little bit dicey from the point of view of Vatican authorities, the fact was that there were substantial Catholic populations within countries who were either fascist or in the case of Nazi Germany, like Nazi, totalitarian, anti-Semitic, and as well as countries that align themselves with the Axis powers, such as Hungary. And there was a broad, shall we say, to the right of centre, if not fully right-wing attitude, which accompanied a sort of an anti-communist attitude, which in turn combines in with a sort of an anti-Bolshevik, anti-Judaism ideology. Something which the Vatican itself, unfortunately, did not energetically condemn or dissociate itself with. And this point has been made by quite a number of historians that really and truly the Vatican sort of had surrendered, in some sense, its moral authority in terms of guiding Catholic states, particularly in Europe, particularly those who were under the sway or under the direct control of fascist totalitarian powers or aligned powers, in terms of, shall we say, guiding the conscience of Catholic constituents within those countries as to what the right and proper and Christian thing was in terms of, right-wing or fascist policies. Now, what I wanted to say was that during the First World War, the Vatican was led by Benedict XV, who was the first, shall we say, anti-war pope in modern papal history. And he was openly anti-war. He referred to the First World War, the Great War, as the suicide of Europe. He deplored he felt, he didn't use the word genocide, but he felt that the working classes of European states, including the Russian Empire, that were engaged in this very heavy attritional conflict, that they were effectively been wiped out by the powerful elites. And so he was as close to a conspiracy theorist, really, in terms of an anti-war conspiracy theorist, as you were likely to find at that time. And he emptied the Vatican treasury to pay for refugees of, shall we say, German invasions, particularly Catholic countries like Belgium, and also refugees in Italy. And it bankrupted the Vatican by the end of the First World War. So I think what influenced the policy of Roman pontiffs after the First World War, and bearing in mind, obviously, that the Vatican itself could not directly order what are known as the ordinaries, or basically the heads of the various Catholic churches in various different European countries, the prelates, like cardinal archbishops in, let's say, in the UK or Ireland or Germany or Italy or any other country. They couldn't interfere directly in, shall we say, the policy of Catholic authorities within these countries in terms of whether they were pro the war effort of their country or against it. They had to adopt a neutral stance. And because of the fact that the Pope at that time had been outspoken and was skirting a very dangerous line with the authorities of many Catholic countries, including Italy, so much so that, it was seen to be decrying their war effort and, sort of being very much counter to the kind of national spirit of sacrifice that these countries were actively promoting. In the interwar decade that followed, the popes towed a very careful line, particularly when it came to dealing with Mussolini. You must remember that in the early 30s, I think around 1930, the Concordat was signed and then the Lateran treaties between the Vatican State, which didn't exist up until that point, and Mussolini's fascist Italy. And this created the Vatican State. This is where the Vatican formally acknowledged that the Papal States had been lost to Italy, and that those former territories were now going to make up this unified Italian state. So finally, this question had been solved after a duration of about 60 to 70 years. It was an historic treaty. It meant that the Vatican formally recognized the unified Italian state. So it was a big breakthrough, and it was a normalization of relations between the Italian state and the Vatican at that particular point. And what happens is that Pope Pius XII, who's the third of a series of Piuses, you have Pius X, 11th, and 12th. He is privately appalled by anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic conduct within Nazi Germany. He was said to have been scandalized by Kristallnacht, and very much advised the papal nuncio in Italy to discourage Mussolini if he ever contemplated adopting a similarly anti-Jewish policy or orchestrating anti-Jewish pogroms within fascist Italy, that he was to be discouraged from doing so as not to emulate the policies of Adolf Hitler, which the Pope actually found quite distasteful. And he was rather restrained during the Second World War in that, because Mussolini committed in June 1940, he committed Italy to the war on Germany's side. So the Pope really did not have the luxury of coming down strongly in favor of the Allied side. But it must be remembered that in the period after the fall of Mussolini as the absolute head of the Italian state and the occupation of Rome by the German forces, the Pope took care to make sure that both Jewish, shall we say, refugees within Rome who were in hiding, and also Allied prisoners of war, as well as Italians who were fleeing from basically pursuing German authorities. Rome was under the authority of an SS colonel called Kepler, who orchestrated a reign of terror and massacred both Italian partisans and also Jews as part of reprisals for attacks on German and SS forces. Kepler was roundly despised and seen as a barbarian by the Vatican authorities. And there was a famous Irish Monsignor named Hugh Flaherty, or Hugh O'Flaherty from County Kerry, who was a very close friend and confidant of the Pope, who oversaw basically the direction of Vatican resources to the end of basically caring for and hiding 4,000 people who were fleeing, pursuing Nazi authorities within Rome and the general environs. And these were hidden within church, monasteries and churches and various different other ecclesiastical sites that were controlled directly by the Vatican all over Rome. And then after the liberation of Rome, the Pope granted papal audiences to Allied troops, including representatives of the Irish Brigade, very famously. So I think it was quite clear that the Pope really ultimately came down on the side of the Allies in terms of the Allied moral conviction, and was very energetically pro-Allied, and in a sense actually granted far more access to Allied authorities after they liberated Rome to the Vatican in terms of audiences and basically allowing them within the confines of the Vatican than he had previously allowed the German occupiers of Rome in the year leading up to the liberation of Rome.
Well, we'll move on now, but quick point. So all the popes after Pius were very severely affected by the war. John the 23rd, who succeeded Pope Pius, he was probably the most philo-Semitic. He was a liberal and he changed, so Vatican II. So he demanded that there were changes in at least the prayers that was said. He was actually based, I think, in Bulgaria and Constantinople during the war. Paul VI, who came after him, was in Rome during the war. And John Paul I, he was only there for less than a month. He was also studying. And the one who was most directly affected, of course, is John Paul II. And he was a student in Krakow. Can you imagine, in Krakow in 1939? And of course, Krakow was the capital of the general government. We dealt with it last week, where a very high portion of the worst atrocities committed by the Nazis occurred. And he only really survived by going to hiding. Anyway, so let's move on to, Scott, I don't know if you've got anything to say on that topic.
Yeah, I'd be interested in Scott's views on any of this, or have you any anecdotes or stories concerning encounters between Irish Brigade troops and the Pope, or anything like that that you'd like to contribute?
I was going to pick up on how you talked there about the kind of complexities of politics and personal opinion. And, in Northern Ireland, if you're looking through records and looking through the press, you don't see a lot of mentions of the Pope at all. But we're a country wrestling with our closest neighbour being a neutral state. And there's lots of back and forth on that. And it's impossible to say, one group of people was wholly anti-Semitic or, left-wing or right-wing, or you can't group politics as you can't kind of assign politics and nationality in the same sort of bracket. And I find it fascinating that, we had people in Northern Ireland and in quite high society who were openly quite pro-fascist. In fact, one soldier who died, I think, in 1944 in North Africa. It's a complex one to write about, because not all those people that I research are heroes. This gentleman, Job Stott, born and raised in Northern Ireland, he was actually the head of the Ulster fascists. And we had other people in quite high society who would have sided with him on those things. And in much of what we read here, it's anti-Pope, it's anti-Catholic, but it's very much done from a parochial, provincial, Northern Irish viewpoint, rather than looking at any kind of global perspective.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Scott. We're now going to move on to 1940, and this is a talking point. Joe, lead us off, and we can see on the left is Molotov, or Michael Palin, as he's known in The Death of Stalin. That shows you he issued the ultimatum to the Finnish government, and he wanted that place called Halu, which is right on the tip. You see, so you see St. Petersburg, Leningrad as it then was. You can see Estonia on one side of the Baltic, and you can see Finland the other side of the Baltic in that narrow passage. And so Molotov said, we want to use that base with the arrow there, which is in Finland, as a naval base. And of course, inevitably, the Finns said no, leading to war. Now, Joe.
What I wanted to point out, first of all, is that I'm not a massive expert on the Winter War, as it's known. But one of the things I would point out in terms of what led to the outbreak of the Winter War, it's a desire by the Soviets to control key strategic territory in Finland. They don't want to occupy the whole of Finland. To a certain extent, that's kind of biting off more than they can chew at that particular point. They just want to have access to a few strategic sites, including a key naval base. And they feel that they are entitled to this for one reason and one reason only. And it's because that Finland at one point was part of the Russian Empire, and the Russians had a base there at the beginning of the First World War, and for a good part of the First World War. And Finland had only been recently had become an independent state. It had fought a very bloody civil war at the point of its independence, following the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Bolshevik Revolution. But Finland faced up to the possibility of a Soviet incursion, and in many respects had been preparing for it in the interwar period. They'd equipped themselves with aircraft that were just about adequate for defense. They weren't brilliant, but they were just about adequate, and probably in many respects much better than the Soviet aircraft that were going to be thrown against them. And they were later, resupplied by, you had Allied and Axis nations supporting the Finns during the Winter War. You had volunteers from various different countries assisting them, including American volunteers. There was a weird agglomerated coalition of both fascist European and Western European and American interests in terms of defending Finland and making sure that they got through the invasion as best they could. And the Soviets, basically when the demands of Molotov are not met, the Soviets make their preparations for an invasion to happen sort of in the lead up to the winter. And this invasion, as many people know, goes absolutely pear-shaped. The Soviets invade with an army of about 1 million, but they are actually completely unprepared for the terrain and the kind of conditions that they will encounter in Finland. There's a lot of low-lying terrain, and basically there's a sort of a problem breaking through hills and ridges, and in certain places mountains, that they're facing on certain parts of their front. And the Finns are able to construct very hastily a defensive line, which it's known as the Mannerheim line, named after one of their top commanders. And bear in mind that the Finns are defending with less than 1/10 of what is invading the country at that point. They have a trained army of approximately 80,000 men, including reservists that are called up, and they're called up rather quickly. And these Finnish soldiers are just about equipped to face down their enemy. It's largely an infantry battle, but the Finns prove to be massively effective. They have just about enough gear, which is basically, it's calibrated for the kind of conditions they're going to be facing. And also, when the winter hits and it's deep into the winter, the Finns become mobile. They're on skis. They have ski troops, a lot of ski troops. They know the terrain. They've grown up in this terrain in this country. They're very familiar with it, and they are highly mobile, and they're able to outmaneuver as infantry the Soviets at every turn. And the Soviets are just basically they're completely stumped. Their armor gets bogged down. They're not really able to bring in air support or artillery support, and Soviet infantry is mown down in droves. It's ambushed, and the morale basically of the Soviet army that invades Finland is on the floor. And eventually it takes until the following year for the Soviets to make a significant breakthrough, at which point the Finnish government sue for peace, and a treaty is basically effectively concluded between the Soviet government and the Finnish government, and the Soviets ultimately get what they want, but they're given a very bloody nose. The morale and self-confidence of Soviet commanders, and as well as Soviet personnel before Barbarossa, is very severely tarnished and also tainted on an international stage. And it leads basically the way in which the Finns, with an inferior force, managed to inflict such heavy casualties upon the Soviet invaders and basically give them a right clobbering, is one of the reasons why Hitler concludes that when he launches his invasion of the Soviet Union, that it's going to be an absolute walkover.
The Italian invasion of Greece, and rather farcical situation. The invasion was declared, the Italians invade, and on that day, Mussolini meets Hitler. And Mussolini says, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. And Hitler apparently afterwards said the bloke was mad, should never have done it, and he should have taken Malta. So Joe, kick us off on this war, and very profound effects for the Nazi Germans, for Germany, as well as, of course, for Greece and Italy.
Yeah, so really what happens is what sparks this war is basically the Italian invasion of Albania. And there's a very clear move to prepare the ground for an incursion into Greece. And the Greeks are having none of it, and they prepare themselves, they mobilize, they call up reservists and also new troops. They're not terribly well equipped, but they're very determined, and the Greeks have a very pragmatic attitude towards this conflict. There's also various different encounters between Italian naval forces and Greek naval forces. You have an instance where a Greek warship, a warship of the Greek Navy, is sunk by an Italian submarine, and you have various different flashpoints which are a prelude to this conflict. But what happens is when the Italians go into Albania, essentially, to make a long story short, the Greeks effectively go into Albania themselves, and they basically kick the living daylights out of the Italians. The Italians get bogged down. They're not able to make headway. There's a lot of battles that take place in sort of narrow valleys in sort of the interior of Albania, away from the coast, where the Italians are looking to sort of move around. But it's literally the worst enemy that they can take on in terrain like this are the Greeks, because the Greeks, particularly their mountain troops, are very well experienced, and they're very confident. And the Greeks once they smell blood, and once they realize that the Italians adversaries that they are meeting don't really have the stomach for a fight, and they're also encountering resistance among the Albanian community themselves. The Albanians are not people that bow down very lightly under these aggressors. The Greeks are able to get local cooperation, and they're able to really run rings around the Italians. And there are massive defeats that occur, almost too many to name. There's one very famous Greek victory where they basically force the Italian army into more or less a general retreat, and they have to withdraw. Essentially, like, the Italians are in Tirana, but they have to withdraw back to a particular defensive position. And the Greeks, what they are doing is, the Italians are surrendering in droves. And what they're doing is their Greek captors are basically asking them very politely, how much gear do you have? Can you show us how this stuff works and whatnot? And the Italians are just basically handing over uniforms. They're handing over trucks, vehicles, machine guns, all the Italian equipment. The Greeks probably think it's garbage, but they make the best of it. And they use a lot of captured Italian weapons to basically redouble their military efforts in the country. It is the Italian reversal in Albania that provokes the personal intervention of Adolf Hitler. What this results in is basically a very crucial diversion of Hitler's forces from Yugoslavia and various different other places in southern Europe that Hitler has originally tasked for the invasion of the Soviet Union. And he needs these key forces in southern Europe basically as part of shoring up the southern flank, because he will not be able to fully depend on his Axis allies, his various different allies in southern and eastern Europe that are going to partake in Barbarossa. So this crucial diversion in 1941 of these forces down into Greece, this is a conflict that runs from 1940 into 41. It results in basically this critical diversion of key resources that the Germans need for their upcoming invasion, which delays their timeline, and they end up going in much later than scheduled. They were planning on going in early summer. It's midsummer by the time they actually launch Operation Barbarossa, because they've only just gotten done with the Greek campaign around May 41. And they've also basically banjaxed one of their elite divisions, an airborne division, in what would effectively amount to being the last great German airborne assault of the Second World War, which was the invasion of Crete, where they basically encountered horrific resistance, not just at the hands of Greek military and British and Commonwealth military defenders, but also the Cretan civilians themselves, who basically, when these German paratroopers land on Cretan soil, are effectively assaulted with scythes, pikes, rocks, anything the Cretan civilians can get their hands on. And there are many German soldiers that are practically bludgeoned to death. So what really happened was Mussolini, by taking on the Greeks, opened up the doorways for a new adversary, which was a country which was combined together, a very tough nut for both the Italians and the Germans to crack, diverting crucial resources at a very critical moment in the war, diverting what Hitler needed to basically prime for his invasion of the Soviet Union, and is probably key to the fact that Barbarossa ultimately ended up failing in 1941, and they didn't reach Moscow in time before the winter had basically, and also the autumn rain, the Rasputitsa that we referred to last week, basically hit and ground down the German military almost to a halt, allowing Zhukov to prepare a counterattack and drive the Germans back from the gates of Moscow.
Okay, well, look, that was the Greek story. Now, I'm going to ask Scott, because also this week in 1940 is the end of the Battle of Britain, Scott. So it's something that's close to your heart, and you've spent a lot of time. What was obviously there's a battle. Obviously, the southeast of England is largely the one that got the most attention. What did the Battle of Britain mean to Northern Ireland? What role did the Northern Ireland play in the Battle of Britain?
The Battle of Britain kind of overwhelmingly fought over the southeast of England, but it wasn't the only part of the UK where the impact of it was felt. There were many pilots, airmen, ground crew from Northern Ireland. I've researched quite a few, and a lot of them didn't survive the Battle of Britain. They didn't make it to this point in 1940. There's a really touching story of fighter pilot, Spitfire pilot called Sidney Ireland, and he had trained with 12 of his friends, and they were on their way from Belfast to an airfield in the southeast of England to complete their training and to really get involved in the Battle of Britain. And he held up the train in Belfast because he had to run back to Matchett's music shop, which, if anybody knows Belfast, is a music shop that's still going. And he picked up an acoustic guitar, and he and all of his friends signed their names and signed the date and signed their squadron numbers on this guitar. And I believe that guitar still exists in one of the museums in Belfast. I'm not sure which one. I'll have to look that up. But that guitar is still there. And sadly, it's a memorial to Sidney Ireland and to several of the other young men who had signed it. And who didn't survive the Battle of Britain. Sidney Ireland himself actually died on the 12th of July, 1940, in a training incident. the connections to the Battle of Britain, I think locally here, are almost tied in with the Polish squadrons as well. I think most people by now know the impact that 303 and 315 Squadron had in the Battle of Britain. 303 Squadron had the highest number of kills of any squadron throughout the course of that battle. And both those squadrons, quite some time after the Battle of Britain, but they both arrived at Ballyhalbert, an airfield out on the Ards Peninsula in County Down. And they were there for kind of rest, recuperation, and retraining after the battle. They had a wonderful time in Northern Ireland, to the extent where several of them stayed, married local women, and there's still quite a few Polish names out in that part of the peninsula now. What I found interesting about this week, and the 31st of October marking the end of the Battle of Britain, was a complete lack of mentions of that in local newspapers. You know, we didn't really play up that this was the end of a momentous occasion. So perhaps this is something that we look back on now, 80 plus years down the line, with more definite deadlines and more definite finite start and end times on things. But what is actually noticeable is if you take the Battle of Britain as a precursor to the Blitz, that this week in 1940 actually marked the first time. So between the 29th of October and the 1st of November 1940 was the first time that air raid sirens were heard in Belfast. So we can see almost a hand-in-hand sort of Battle of Britain has ended and Luftwaffe tactics have changed. There are spotter planes, reconnaissance planes over places as far-flung as Belfast. And excuse me, already we can see the complacency in Belfast that was to be their downfall. We can see newspaper reports of sirens going off on this week in 1940 and people not really paying much attention to them because that belief that the Luftwaffe would never bomb Northern Ireland kind of existed right up until 1941.
That's great insights. Thanks very much, Scott. I'm now going to press on to 1941. So that's Roosevelt. He had won the election the previous year. So he's in his third term. And he makes a very, I read out the text of the speech, and this is in October. Okay, so we're still 6 weeks, something like a month away from Pearl Harbor. At this point, the majority of Americans, I'm sure, didn't want war and didn't think they should be involved. But he got up and he basically said, he denounced Hitlerism. He said, we are providing weapons for the people actually doing the fighting. Psychologically, of course, he's kind of preparing the country for what's going to happen. And this point was made by Charles Lindbergh, of course. There he is. He's speaking. It's called Defend America First. So America First was his movement. Has echoes of what we hear today in America. And they didn't want to be involved in the war. We want to stick to our own things. And he said in the speech in Madison Square Gardens this week, he said, Roosevelt is actually taking us into war. Now, we discussed that a bit last week. Now, Joe, evaluate these two moments. You've got Roosevelt, triumphant in his third term, clearly preparing to join the war in more than one way, and also publicly, in a way, in that speech he made. And then you got Lindbergh, on the other hand, really pushing and saying, look, this guy's going to take us into the war and we've got to stop it. So what does history judge now at this point? I mean, Lindbergh in October in 1941 was a very influential figure in America. That's right, isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, it is. It is absolutely. I mean, we basically have a clash of personalities going. Bear in mind that Lindbergh has had been mooted as a presidential candidate and had ultimately, thank God, lost out in terms of his particular ambitions. There's a drama series called, The Plot Against America, which reimagines essentially the course of American history at this time. It envisions in a horrifying degree basically what would have happened if Roosevelt had lost the election at around, and charts this really from the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, and essentially the Europe falling into the grip of Nazism, and it's from the perspective of the American Jewish community, and it's looking at what would have happened if America had fallen into the clutches of the movement that Lindbergh was leading, which was in many respects an overtly fascist movement. And people forget that actually there was a period in time in the late 30s going into the early 40s where you actually had a lot of Americans that were very openly pro-Nazi and very sympathetic to the cause of Nazi Germany. And I'm not just talking about German Americans. I'm talking about Irish Catholics. I'm talking about Italian Catholics. I'm talking about people who are non-Jewish, who they had this view that basically Roosevelt was very much in the pocket of Wall Street Jewish bankers. So there was this kind of thing going, a very, very much an anti-Semitic veneer to it. But Roosevelt, on Navy Day, his speech reads as follows: "When we have helped to end the curse of Hitlerism, we shall help to establish a new peace which will give to decent people everywhere a better chance to live and prosper in security and in freedom and in faith. Each day that passes, we are producing and providing more and more arms for the men who are fighting on actual battlefronts. That is our primary task." So he is directing, before the United States formally enters the war, he is directing the manufacturing resources to a great degree towards the end of supplying the Allied forces, particularly the British and Commonwealth forces, in their struggle against Axis forces globally. That's for the moment, that is just Germany and fascist Italy. The Japanese are not to feature at this particular point, but there is a growth of Japanese aggression and they can see war coming down the line. But for the moment, this is basically the United States of America becoming, in the words of Roosevelt himself, the arsenal of democracy. And Lindbergh's speech at Madison Square Garden is essentially a rallying cry, one of the last great rallying cries of the American isolationist movement that want to fight bitterly against this whole idea of mobilizing the United States and preparing. They know they're going to war, and they're already setting in place the infrastructure necessary to move into what will become the ETO, the European Theater of Operations, before they formally enter the war. And on this point, I would like to go over to Scott to give us some details about the ways in which Northern Ireland witnessed the pre-America's declaration of war, the preparations for this eventual arrival of the formal arrival of American forces into the European campaign, and what part the North played in this particular, shall we say, friendly invasion, shall we call it?
Well, yes, friendly invasion is the phrase that's most commonly used, and the kind of opinion on that is that the first American to set foot in Europe during the Second World War was Private First Class Milburn Henke on the 26th of January 1942. Firstly, that's incorrect, because even the photos and newsreel footage of the time show that there were hundreds and hundreds of Americans already ashore. He was the good-looking poster boy of the US Army who had been chosen as the kind of public face of it. But really, by that stage, American accents in certain parts of Northern Ireland were not that uncommon. Derry, in particular, had thousands of what were called technicians. Many of them were sort of unofficially military personnel, but in civilian clothing, who had been there, like you say, kind of putting together infrastructure, working on what would eventually become Base 1 Europe, working on the naval docks at Lissahalli, also right down into Fermanagh, You had the provision of planes like the Catalina operating out of Castle Archdale. And just as an indication of how far back that was going, we're talking about kind of the end of October being, you know, in advance of Pearl Harbor and in advance of the US formally entering the war. But as far back as like mid 1941, the sinking of the Bismarck. The Bismarck was actually sighted by an American co-pilot in a Catalina. His name was Leonard Tuck Smith, and he was operating out of Castle Archdale as a civilian technician. He had been sent over as part of a deal to train RAF pilots on how to operate the Catalina aircraft. So yeah, we'd thousands of Americans here working on airfields, working on docks, working on that massive infrastructure that was going to be required. Because obviously at the back of someone's mind, there was the knowledge that Northern Ireland would be that jumping off point into the ETO. And, you know, these things don't happen overnight. So we had the guts of a year there of all the groundwork being laid for that.
Okay, well, Scott, that's great. We'll now move on to 42, and here we are. You know, there's a date that practically everybody knows. That's Battle of El Alamein. This time in 1942 was the Operation Supercharge, which is the second phase of the second Battle of El Alamein. That's a map. So it shows you, or this is you're in the Western Egypt. El Alamein is the railway junction. So to call it the Battle of El Alamein is a bit inaccurate because it's a huge front that extends from the Mediterranean coast all the way down to the Qatar Depression. And the battle had been launched by the 8th Army, led by Bernard Montgomery, a Northern Irishman originally, of Northern Irish descent. And so we get into a critical phase of this battle with the breakthrough at last happening. Joe, Winston Churchill said that before El Alamein there were no victories, after El Alamein there were no defeats. But that's not accurate, is it? Because they were victories. Why does El Alamein get so much attention in British Second World War history?
I would argue that it doesn't nearly get enough. I mean, if you think, I'm just thinking of Charlie Lawson's recent irate, expletive-laden video about Battle of Britain Day, which was posted on Battle of Britain Day on Instagram and also on X, about basically he doesn't know what the F is going on with this country. None of the young people know that it's Battle of Britain Day. Well, if people's knowledge about basic things, staple events of the Second World War is in critical decline at the moment, I think the furthest event from people's minds is the Battle of El Alamein, which probably about 20, 30 years ago would have been more widely known. But is virtually, I think, in many respects, it's slipped to the very rearward recesses of people's minds. It's not something that's regularly commemorated. There's no formal commemoration site outside of Egypt itself to commemorate the Battle of El Alamein, and the big gatherings for 8th Army veterans, and particularly those who fought in the battle, used to take place in Blackpool, of all places. And there was a big movement around that, and for about 20 to 30 years or so, you had big gatherings of 8th Army veterans at Blackpool where they commemorated this particular battle and other key events that the 8th Army took place in, but particularly this battle. And this kind of thing has, is virtually unknown now. But the reason it's important, and by the way, it's important to remember that there are two battles of El Alamein. The first one takes place in July, following the retreat from Tobruk. Tobruk has been held by the British and Commonwealth forces after it was taken from the Italians. They held it against repeated assaults by Erwin Rommel's Panzer Armee Africa, basically, or the Panzer Corps Africa, which is basically the Africa Corps, assisted by their Italian allies that they were bolstering. And this is around the time 41, going into 42, where Rommel shows himself to be the talented commander that he is known to be in terms of the war of maneuver in the desert, and the war seesawing back and forth. There are attempts to relieve Tobruk, but basically there's this famous siege which makes the Australian 7th Division globally famous as basically the rats at Tobruk, assisted by commandos, assisted by Czechs and by Poles and by Indians as well, holding out this port city basically on the coast that's basically holding out against assaults from all sides on land. Tobruk falls, resulting in the capture of the better part of a South African division, and which is holding it at the time. And Rommel takes Tobruk with the capture of about 30,000 prisoners, British and Commonwealth prisoners. Churchill is with Roosevelt at the moment that he's informed of the news of the fall of Tobruk, and Roosevelt sees him flinch in pain. He looks actually to be in agony, and he sees that he's in despair, and Churchill kind of mutters under his breath that they won't fight, they won't hold out, I don't know what to do. This is basically Churchill's low point, following a few months after the fall of Singapore. And there's a general feeling that Britain and the Commonwealth are really kind of in terms of their morale, they're on their last legs. It's just like, we can't do this on our own anymore. We need more support. And Roosevelt turns to one of his aides and basically, simple order, he said, send 500 of our Sherman tanks to Port Said right away. And during the Second Battle of El Alamein, to fast forward, begins on the 23rd of October 1942, what essentially happens is this American supplied armor starts to kick in the Western Desert. You've got Grants and you've got Shermans. They are able to field about nearly 300 of these. The full complement of 500 doesn't fully arrive, but what arrives is enough, and it bolsters supplies of British armor that has basically been supplied into the field, including the Crusader tanks, which have a poor kind of armament. It's not brilliant armament. It's only effective at very close range. But a Crusader tank is the fastest tank that the British have. And they use it in this battle and in the aftermath of this battle to great effect. Originally, the Crusader tank was basically meant to be used prior to the Battle of El Alamein as part of an assault to relieve Tobruk and basically drive Rommel back. It really comes into its own in this particular battle when the Eighth Army get the Germans and their Italian allies on the run, when their positions, their defensive positions at El Alamein basically break, and when they basically go into retreat. And what's critical here, and this is leading to my point, Supercharge, the anniversary of which we are commemorating, which happens on the 2nd of November this week in the Second World War, as well as the anniversary of the outbreak of, the start of the Battle of El Alamein, which falls on the 23rd. Supercharge is basically designed to break the deadlock. They've launched multiple assaults on key Axis strong points, and they're breaking through in different places, but they need to break through in strength on the northern flank. Their attack on the northern flank, where the Germans are primarily concentrated, is essentially, it's weighed down because of the fact that the Germans are holding firm at places like Ruisat Ridge, which is a contested point between the British and Commonwealth lines and the German lines, and they need to break through here. So basically what spearheads this assault is essentially a grinding attritional battle involving infantry and armor. And you basically have two divisions. If you look to the north of this map, you've got 30 Corps with Brian Horrocks, basically the 30 Corps fame, essentially at the top. And 30 Corps basically is later involved in the attack in northwest Europe, from Normandy all the way through Arnhem, and then basically into northwest Germany. So 30 Corps up there under Horrocks. And you also have British Second Corps as well. And between 30 Corps and Second Corps, basically their task is basically to break through at the Ruisat Ridge, where the Germans are still holding them. They are grinding the Germans down. They're attacking them by air. There's artillery bombardments, but they're still not making a sizable breakthrough. They need to break through at this key strong point. And what essentially happens is they select the 2nd New Zealand Division under the command of General Bernard Freyberg, famous for being the commander at Crete, who basically lost Crete, but anyway, he's brought back in to lead this spearhead attack to basically break the deadlock, because they must break the Axis positions now and basically force their way through. And it has to be done. And the 2nd New Zealand Division go up against their adversaries that they've met time and again, the 90th German Light Division. And you also have a German Panzer Division that basically comes up against 1st Armored Division, and one key formation within 1st Armored Division that really plays a key role in the breakthrough, suffering more than 50% losses of their armour, is the British 9th Armoured Brigade. 7th Armoured, the famous 7th Armoured, are also involved in this battle, sort of on further south to the left, to the left of their advance. But it's really the 9th Armoured working in coordination with other 1st Armoured elements, but particularly with the New Zealand Division, which is the infantry complement in the spearhead advance. They push their way into well-defended German positions with German PaK anti-tank weapons, 88s, whatever tanks they have left, because they are running critically short. And they grind their way into this strong point and punch a hole. And by the end of the 2nd of November, the decision is taken by Rommel in consultation with his commanders and with his Italian allies to basically order a general withdrawal, which starts to take place over the next few days. So by the 5th of November, which is day 13 of the Battle of El Alamein, it's a battle that goes on for 13 days. Essentially, the Montgomery has won, and Supercharge is the key offensive as part of after the failure of Operation Lightfoot, which results in this breakthrough at El Alamein, and basically the Axis forces go into almost complete retreat. And the Italians in the southern flank are effectively, they fold, and many of them are actually cut off. The Germans, however, are the first to bolt, and they only have 2 days of fuel left, so they have to use that to get the heck out of Dodge, and that basically results in the British chasing them out of Egypt into Libya, and basically they chase them all the way to Tunisia, where they end up by the beginning of 1943.
Okay, well, Scott, any comments on El Alamein from a Northern Irish perspective, perhaps?
Actually, my sort of personal connection to the Second World War is through the Western Desert. My own grandfather fought in the Western Desert, but he didn't participate in either First or Second Battle of El Alamein. By that stage, he was a prisoner of war in Italy. He unfortunately had that period of, it was talked before El Alamein, there were only defeats. While there weren't only defeats, there were many of them, and he'd gone through defeat both on Crete, where his squadron from 7 Royal Tank Regiment had been sent in 1941, came back from Crete, and the absolute catastrophe of Operation Battle Axe. He was captured and taken prisoner of war in 17th of June 1941. So yeah, I've a strong family connection to that theater of war, but sadly, my family connection missed out on the kind of glory of those great victories.
Did he escape in September 43 from the camp, or was he moved to Germany?
Oh, that I could talk for a long time on this, but yeah, he left the camp in September 43 and went on the run for several weeks. We have handwritten letters that talk about his kind of escape and what he did. He jumped from various trains. Before that, he'd already tunneled out of another of Campo PG-53, and he was recaptured every time, and basically from 1941 to 1945 spent his time escaping, being recaptured, and eventually ended up at Stalag 4B in Mühlberg in Germany.
Very interesting. Well, we must talk about that more, because I have lots of connections with the children of men who did the great Italian escape of September 43. Now we're moving on to 1943, Battle of Goodenough Island, Treasury Island, sorry. Not well known, but it did involve the New Zealanders. Quite an important moment for the New Zealanders. And as you can see, Treasury Island, this is almost spherical island. And to find it, you see in the map on the right, you can see Bougainville. So it's south of Bougainville Islands. So it's to the east of Papua New Guinea. It's part of an extensive campaign in the Solomon Islands, other islands, to secure that flank of the Southern Pacific and drive the Japanese off. Joe, you have a few insights on this particular moment.
Well, this is when this is a kind of a prelude to the Marines basically moving in force in Bougainville, which is a horrendous campaign. It's just basically the weather is atrocious. It saps their morale. They're able to fight off and defeat the Japanese on Bougainville, but the fact of the matter is Bougainville prior to this was a Japanese strong point. They feel that they need to capture Bougainville in order to drive the Japanese out of this particular part of the Solomons and clear the way for further advances to the north. So it's a key part. I think it's really coming into the last stages of basically American strategy to defeat the Japanese in the South Pacific, so that they can concentrate more on the Central Pacific theater, the island hopping campaign, particularly because they were around about this time or shortly afterwards, they will attack Tarawa, which will be one of the first of these great opposed landings on these tiny little specks of sand and coral across the Pacific that the Marines and the Army are bleeding themselves dry in order to give them the airfields that they need to basically hop closer to Japan and start an effective bombing campaign. And we'll come to this a little bit later when we talk about the first super fortress to fly over Japan. But this whole campaign, both in the South Pacific and then later in the Central Pacific, is about taking key strategic places in order to give them airfields. Often they're Japanese airfields that are basically in place that they take and they reconstitute. They lay down their own gear, their own they put down basically iron mesh trackways for the American aircraft. So basically the Americans can essentially, during the rainfall, the Japanese don't have this gear, but during the heavy rains, the runways are churned up, and the runways from the air that the Japanese are creating, they're just basically able to use them. They're not all-weather constructions at all. Whereas when the Americans move in, they put in this basically gridded iron mesh runway tracking, which basically allows them to use the runway in all weathers, because when it starts raining, essentially it just basically goes through the grilling into the ground, and it's almost like waterproofing the runways, and the Americans are just basically nabbing key strategic points here and there, including key naval sites, and also designing new ones as well, and resupply stations as they go. The attack on the Treasury Islands, just for context, involving a New Zealand brigade, is part of this effort to support what will later be the landings on Bougainville, to give them air cover. So they need to. It's a tactic that the Allies in the Pacific theater will use time and again, where they seize smaller island holdings in close proximity to larger land masses, in order to give them the option to provide the air cover that's necessary without necessarily having to go cap in hand to the Navy for aircraft carriers, that they can actually run their bombers and run their fighter aircraft into these newly captured sites in order to support amphibious landings and air support operations during basically landings on much larger targets like Bougainville itself. And an example of this is basically the landings on Peleliu. The landings on Peleliu ostensibly were to take a Japanese airfield on the Palau Chain Islands in order to support the landings, support the basically the Allied invasion of the Philippines, or at the very least to remove effectively or the air threat from this key Japanese base that was designed to defend the Philippines from the east. So the Treasury Islands, as Paul Wood had said last week, he'd never even heard of the Treasury Islands. I had heard of the Treasury Islands attack. I knew it involved the New Zealand, the Second New Zealand Brigade, I think it is. But beyond that, I have to say that the Treasury Islands operation is something that I would have been rather lacking in knowledge of, and it's an example of one of these many campaigns during the Second World War that's barely known about.
Okay, well, let's move on to another moment in October, and that's the Moscow Declaration. See the photograph here. You've got on the right Anthony Eden, Britain's Foreign Secretary. In the centre, you've got Molotov, and on the left, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State. On the left is the Chinese minister. That's the government of Chiang Kai-shek, not the communist government. Now, why does the Moscow Declaration, this is one, it's a series of meetings in October 1943, why does it matter, Joe?
Because it matters because what's effectively happening with the Moscow Declaration is it's essentially in effect this is kind of a moment that's designed to kind of emulate what Churchill and Roosevelt achieved with the Atlantic Charter, which is basically it's a mission statement for the combined Allied powers, the great powers that are involved in the war. And at the Atlantic Charter, which predated the involvement of the Americans in the war, committed the British and the Americans to a joint purpose. They were formalizing or essentially an alliance in joint cause even before the Americans became involved. And the Americans are agreeing, sort of a set of aims. If we're going to fight as allies together, this is the kind of war. This is the kind of world that we want to create after the war. And it's more the aims of the Atlantic Charter that are important rather than the Moscow Declaration. The Moscow Declaration is essentially, it's designed to kind of bring a formalization of what the other powers that are involved in the war, i.e. the Soviet Union and China, which is not communist at that particular point, is not. They formally recognized Kuomintang under General Chiang Kai-shek as being the legitimate government of China, to basically take over full control of China after the war once they defeat the Japanese. And what they are simply doing with the Moscow Declaration is that they are setting forth their purpose for the post-war world once they defeat the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and inflict a comprehensive defeat within all theaters. And it's essentially what they are committing themselves to. So you might call the Moscow Declaration in some respect, and not a lot of historians would make this particular analogy, but in some ways, it's kind of like an Atlantic Charter Part 2. It's essentially extending the mission statement to the other key allies as well, rather than the Americans and the British basically outlining or, rubber stamping effectively the vision for the post-war world. They have to get the Soviets and the Chinese to sign up to this. And effectively, it's a little known episode. It's not really seen in the grand scheme of things as being particularly significant. And as we will later see from the result of the Yalta Conference, it's basically not worth the paper it's written on.
Okay, well, Joe, thanks very much. But it also set the scene for the Tehran conference. I can speak with a little bit of personal experience. I visited the British Embassy when I was in Tehran. I went actually to the building where the Tehran conference took place. And the Tehran conference, of course, is the meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the big three. And that sets the scene. A lot of decisions are made, built on the Moscow Declaration. Okay, now we're moving on. Here we go. Now, that's a B-29 Super Fortress. And in this time, at the end of 1944, and we're moving over, we're skipping the de Gaulle telling the French resistance to disarm. using authority, said it's now, you've got to be the official army, like commanded by me, not running around shooting people. So the super fortress, this is the first time, that's in October, November 1944, it's the first time that an American bomber has flown over Japan since the Doolittle raid. The famous Doolittle raid was depicted in one of the worst films ever made about the war, Pearl Harbor, with Doolittle played by very chunky Baldwin. He looked nothing like Doolittle, who was a little wizened, bald old man. But this is the B-29. So the B-29 really was a piece of lethal equipment, Joe.
I mean, the B-29 was purposely designed for the bombing of Japan. And it was also you had a program called the B-29 program. Now, for more information about this, people should read the excellent Hiroshima Men, published recently by, I'm just trying to remember the author. Scott, can you come in? He's a famous publisher. He also wrote The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. Just trying to remember his name. But he published a book recently called The Hiroshima Men, and it talked about how the nuclear program, or the atomic program, the Manhattan Project and the B-29 project, were two side projects that basically almost complemented one another. You had the ultimate aim really was to get close to Japan, as I was talking about the island hopping campaign, in order to get these long range bombers. And they reckoned that B-17s and B-24 Liberators, which they were using in the Pacific campaign, would simply not have the range to be able to attack Japan in force and basically with a sufficient bomb capacity. They also needed something that would carry a heavy weapon, like a super bomb of some particular kind. So this bomber was designed with this in mind. It was a lot of trial and error. There were a lot of problems with it, particularly at the prototype stage, but they eventually ironed it out and perfected it. So the first flights of the B-29 that take place around this time, 80 years ago, the first flight, 79 years ago, these first flights were kind of almost like test flights they were flown off the Marianas. Saipan had been taken by the Marines and by the Army, and essentially they are basing these bombers out of ultimately Tinian and Guam, and they create these massive bases from which ultimately the Japanese mainland would be bombed and incinerated by the air forces under the command of Curtis LeMay. And Curtis LeMay goes from being a colonel in 1943 to being basically a brigadier general in 1944. And he's going to be overseeing this bombing campaign because he was ruthlessly effective when he was within the 8th Air Force in England. And he was seen to be a very capable commander, getting the best out of his men, and had a very daring, very kind of pioneering spirit. So they reckon he's the best commander to figure out how to do this the right way. But they're finding with these early test flights of the B-29, which is a bomber designed for high altitude missions, basically you're into the stratosphere. They find that unfortunately this particular bomber is defective in one particular respect, and it's not actually the bomber itself. It's to do with the Norden bomb sight with which the bomber is equipped. Works fine on a B-17 and a B-24, does the job. It's not nearly going to get the accuracy that it was always promised with this bomb sight, which itself was the result of one of these hyped up, expensive projects to basically drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from, several tens of thousands of feet. What they discover actually when these bombers hit the stratosphere is that they're basically coming up against headwinds and tailwinds, which makes the Norden bomb sight completely useless at that altitude, because that bomb sight is not calibrated to deal with basically the speed at which the bomber is traveling when it's traveling within either the headwind or the tailwind. And essentially, when you drop a bomb at that altitude with those kind of forces, essentially the bombs are not just miles, but tens of miles off target. because essentially you're moving faster than basically the actual ranging will allow for within the bomb site. So this is the key deficiency that they are discovering during these early flights, which means that this bomber that was designed for high altitude bombing, like super high altitude bombing, has to be used at far lower altitudes than what it was originally intended for, which will lead to heavy losses and attrition of the bomber force that are going to be equipped with these brand new aircraft. And it actually ultimately is, it will lead to basically bombing raids that will happen at much lower altitude to devastating effect, including the firebombing of Tokyo.
Scott, any observations on the Superfortress B-29?
The B-29 is not something that the people in Northern Ireland here ever experienced. Being in the European theater of operation, the biggest kind of US planes that would have been here would have been the B-17s. But just on the note of a B-17, I would challenge your worst ever World War II film, and I would challenge you to watch Closing the Ring, directed by Attenborough, which is about the crash of a B-17 in Belfast, and it is truly terrible.
Okay, well, I like these insightful observations on popular culture, and that's a film that I won't have to spend my time watching. Now we're going to move on. I mean, I'm not going to actually discuss this because I think that would take days. But this glamour shot of Tito was taken, I think, at the end of '44. He's now been named as Prime Minister of Yugoslavia. So when the the army starts advancing towards Austria, and my father's the Irish Brigade actually encountered the Yugoslav partisans as they entered into Eastern Austria in 1945. They were called partisans, but it was actually the Yugoslav army. But we can come back to that on another occasion. Let's move on to 1945. Now, we're now at the period after the war and the settling of scores, one might say, or the application of justice, others might say, is taking place. That is General Yamashita. He's just been indicted. He's been tried in Manila by US military courts. So, Joe, over to you on this particular matter.
So we touched upon this in an offline conversation with Paul Woodage. The trial of Yamashita has long-term consequences for essentially the conduct of military commanders in wars. In other words, they are no longer exempt from prosecution in the post-war world, even after the terms of surrender have been agreed. As one of the consequences of an unconditional surrender, essentially you have a tacit basically recognition of basically the extension of rights to captured enemy prisoners and also their commanders as well. Yamashita is one of these commanders, as certain German commanders, including Jodl and Keitel, high-ranking officers, who's brought in for a war crimes trials and basically indicted for basically crimes against humanity. And essentially, the reason for this, and it's like there's a bit of controversy around Yamashita's indictment and his trial and ultimate execution. The reason why Yamashita is facing this is because of an abdication of moral responsibility over the prisoners that he captured. He was responsible for overseeing the offensives both in Malaya and Singapore, which led to the capture of Singapore. So he's the commander that's responsible for capturing Singapore and taking about, I think it's something in the order of 29,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners, including Australians, and also American prisoners on the Philippines after the fall of Corregidor and Bataan. And you have the Bataan Death March that takes place in the aftermath of the surrender of MacArthur's deputy, whose name escapes me for a moment. Basically, in the aftermath, So Yamashita did not honor his obligations as a sort of a victor in both those campaigns with respect to the treatment of POWs. While there's some dispute over whether he was directly responsible for what took place, the fact of the matter is, and also whether he possibly violated commitments that he made during the surrender at Singapore, the surrender negotiations with Arthur Percival in February 1942. The simple fact of the matter is that the British and Commonwealth POWs were carted off through Malaya up into Thailand to basically build, in barbaric circumstances, the Thai-Burma Railway, which is we all know about, and then also what happens to American POWs in the Philippines, as well as Filipino POWs, is nothing short of abhorrent. Basically force-marched and starved to death in camps in the years to follow, or shipped to Japan to endure slave labor. So it's basically it's effectively war crimes that have been perpetrated against prisoners of war, which is the primary reason why he's facing trial. And it's also the conduct of his own forces with respect to those newly captured prisoners of war and massacres. And one thing he bears heavy responsibility for is the fact that his forces massacred the residents of a hospital in Singapore in the most atrocious barbaric act of the fall of Singapore, which was a prelude to what was to come. The fact of the matter is that he did not exercise his moral authority to restrain his forces from atrocities and from barbaric conduct, both towards enemy prisoners of war and also civilians as well, who suffered very greatly under the occupation of forces that he had at one point commanded. And he definitely will be remembered as the most talented Japanese general of the war in terms of the great sweeping victories that he was able to win. And these were brilliant tactical and strategic victories fought against forces that actually were very often better equipped than his own were and better supplied. And also, one of the big gambles was basically when he took Singapore, the force that he was facing had far more ammunition. They could have held out for a lot longer, and his ammunition supplies, he had basically less than 48 hours left before his forces completely ran out of ammunition. So Percival had actually held out. The Japanese probably wouldn't have been able to take Singapore in the first place. But it's one of the great what ifs. But ultimately, Yamashita's trial and basically the guilty verdict is a prelude to war crimes trials that happen for other military commandos, including basically you see the precedent for what happens during Yamashita's trial been replicated in the trial of I think Vlatko Mladic, a Serbian military commander in the early 2000s, when he's arrested and tried at The Hague for war crimes.
Rather depressing further story, which is to do with Dachau. Dachau was liberated by the American Army, 45th Division, actually. Thunderbird Division was one of the liberating groups. The Thunderbird Division came up, Salerno, the Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, then the South France, and then they got to Dachau, and they liberated Dachau along with another American formation. Of course, at the time, there was some of the American soldiers took justice into their own hands and shot some of the guards out of hand, but some were tried. And this rather grim photograph shows you the number. We'll have a discussion, but I've circled one chap here who's one of the men who's been tried in the Dachau trial. I mean, the Dachau prisoner of war camp was set up, it was more or less the first concentration camp developed by the Nazis for its political opponents. So it wasn't an extermination camp, at least initially, although people worked to death and they starved. Now I've circled one guy, and that guy is Dr. Klaus Schiller. And there he is, a photograph taken. He was 74 when he went on trial. And he's a qualified doctor, very highly regarded researcher. He had been linked to Benito Mussolini to do research into malaria amongst the Italian soldiers. And he was very learned. He was internationally regarded. And he was deployed in Dachau. And what he did was use experimental therapies on the prisoners. So he was testing out, they gave them a malaria, so they infected them with malaria, and they used various therapies. Most of the therapies did more damage than good, and they killed dozens and dozens of inmates. Now, he always said that he was innocent. He actually, at the trial, said, keep me alive because I need to finish my work. That was his argument. Interesting moral argument, because my work will save lives. And then before he was executed, because he was convicted, he was the oldest convicted Nazi war criminal who actually was sentenced to death and executed. And he said, before he was hanged, he said, I'm innocent, just get on with it. So, Joe, and the final, we're now come to the end of the date, so we can have a final chat together about that. Any observations on Dachau, Scott, and the war crimes trials?
Just on Dachau, one of the first American soldiers in to liberate Dachau was a Belfast man, Teddy Dixon. He sadly passed away back in 2020. He was 100 years old. He'd been born in New York, but raised in Northern Ireland. So then he was drafted into the U.S. Army. He was involved in the initial liberation of Dachau, but he was also one of the people who the movie The Monuments Men was based on. So as part of that kind of roundup of prisoners, he guarded a group of German prisoners of war. He wasn't really told at the time what they were doing, but they were a group that had been sent out to retrieve a bunch of stolen art and artifacts from salt mines. Teddy spoke often in Belfast and around Northern Ireland, and was really, really great at educating young people, educating school kids. And I believe there was a documentary made a few years ago by Double Band Films. It's worth checking out the story of Teddy Dixon, who served in the 42nd Rainbow Division, and finding out more about him and his liberation of Dachau.
Joe?
I don't really have much to add about that. I was rather hoping that Scott would make that point, actually, about Teddy Dixon. And it's a documentary that aired, I think it wasn't just BBC Northern Ireland, I think it featured on mainstream BBC TV. And there was a wonderful moment where Teddy Dixon was in the site of Dachau camp, basically been brought back so many years, I think it was 70 years after those events took place. And he was introduced to a group of German gymnasium students who were touring Dachau, and he was introduced to them. It wasn't planned. He was introduced to them, and basically he was introduced by the teacher leading them. This man was one of the first liberators of Dachau, and there was a pause, and all the German students broke into an applause. And it was just a wonderful moment, just illustrated, obviously, how much Germany had changed, and sort of the German, basically, a feeling of acknowledgement of the wrongdoing that had taken place, and also the appreciation of what the liberators of Dachau accomplished. Just a last point that I would make about those that are going on trial. I think the model, because the trials of the camp guards and staff, I hate calling them staff. They don't really. Because of their grotesque acts, they barely count as human beings, in my view. But the fact of the matter is that the prelude to the Dachau trials and the model for it in many respects are the Bergen-Belsen trials, which are the first war crimes trials, which are mounted by the British, and they don't beat about the bush. They don't hesitate in putting the people responsible for Bergen-Belsen on trial, including former camp personnel. I think that's probably the most accurate way of calling them. SS personnel that were involved in Auschwitz, as well as later at Bergen-Belsen, were transferred over from Auschwitz after they abandoned that camp in the face of the Red Army, and were basically transferred into Bergen-Belsen in order to do their dirty work. So, I think very much what's happening at Dachau basically is following from what is taking place at Bergen-Belsen, which provides the model for the trying of Nazi war criminals in the post-war, the immediate post-war period.
Okay, gents. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 1 hour and 41 minutes, believe it or not, but it's flown by. It's been fascinating. I want to thank you both for joining us tonight on This Week in the Second World War. Thanks very much, Scott. Wish you every possible success with your project. Now, I'm just going to say a few closing words. Don't go away, chaps. I'll come back to you in a minute. And I want to say thank you for being with us. I can see people are still watching us live. This show is going to go on YouTube. It's recorded, so you can watch it at your leisure. I think there was a huge amount of interesting information. Some of it much of it extremely insightful and very enjoyable. So thank you very much for watching us. We're going to be back again next week around this time, every Tuesday, for your favorite Second World War YouTube shows. So until then, from everybody here in This Week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.